On Facebook Live, YouTube Live, and on our website, lettertophilippi.org. So welcome, everyone. This is the Letter to Philippi Live broadcast for today. And my name is Sean Emsley. I will be your teacher as we will be looking today at the first part of Philippians chapter 3. And Paul dealing with opponents that he's warning the people of Philippi to be aware of and to be ready to stand against their false teaching. And we'll be looking at the differing views of who these false teachers are, these people who he will call dogs, evil workers, and those who are mutilated. And we'll look at different perspectives, and we'll be giving a fresh new Messianic Jewish perspective today on these verses, which have sadly been used against the Jewish people by different Christian scholars, and even today, as we'll see even in modern Christian teaching, this section is actually these verses are actually used as a polemic against Judaism and Jewish practice. It's a little too much. Okay, alrighty, so we'll get started. And again, this is Letter to Philippi Live, and I am your teacher, Sean Emsley. And we'll begin with a word of prayer, and then we'll look at a new perspective on Paul's letter to the Philippians, Philippians chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. Oh, Lord, you're good. We thank you for this day, Lord. We thank you for our Messiah. We thank you that we have this new life because of him. We thank you for these words of your righteous servant, Paul. We're teaching to the people of Philippi that we can reflect on today in our own lives, so that we become, as Paul calls us to be, more and more and more in Messiah. We thank you for this day. We bless your holy name. We thank you for your holy word that we can look at today, Lord. Amen. So we will be looking, as I said, we'll keep working on my... Okay, that's about as good as I'm going to get it. Okay, today we'll be looking at Philippians chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, the first part of the third chapter on the letter to the Philippians. And here we see in the third chapter that Paul here begins this third chapter with a warning against false teachers, which we'll see in verse 2. Depending on the scholar that writes on this or teaches on this, these false teachers were either real individuals threatening the gospel message in Philippi, or they were potential false teachers who could be coming to Philippi now that the gospel message was being spread among the Gentile populace. So there's a debate among biblical scholars whether this was an actual current threat to the community, that these false teachers were already in Philippi, and Paul was warning them to stand against their false teachings. Or it could be that he was pre-warning them, knowing that these false teachers were going about, and he wanted them to understand that these false teachers had to be confronted. So, as I said, there's a debate whether this was an actual threat that was currently in the community, or Paul was pre-warning the people of Philippi. But in any case, he's dealing with what he sees as a potential threat to the community among false teachers coming in. Today, I want to give a fresh Messianic look at this chapter, which is important in considering that the earliest Christian commentaries use this chapter as a polemic against Judaism, the Judaism and Jewish practice, specifically circumcision. Since the earliest writings by the church fathers, we'll be looking more specifically at the works of John Chrysostom of 4th century fourth century church father and Christian scholar of that time, who took this passage, these verses, this verse 3:2, and used it as Paul teaching against the continuance of Jewish practice, specifically circumcision among the Christian community. So this I said is reflected into the commentaries today. In my research for my Messianic commentary on Philippians, I looked at almost 100 different commentaries on Philippians, and pretty much everyone on this passage follows Chrysostom's example and sees that this verse we'll be looking at, verse 2 of chapter 3, as Paul putting forward rejection of Judaism, Jewish practice, specifically circumcision, and teaching that circumcision is no longer acceptable for those who call Yeshua Lord. As I said, most notably in this opinion are the fourth century homilies of John Chrysostom. John Chrysostom wrote what he called a series of homilies, or sermons on Philippians, which also was, in essence, his commentary on the book of Philippians. And his work is the basis for the anti-Judaism bias prevalent in most Christian Philippian commentaries today. That was one of the impetus that I wanted to write a Messianic Jewish commentary on the book of Philippians, because one of the great flaws of the great scholarship that's out there on the Philippians, the book of Philippians, and this letter to Philippi, is that anti-Judaism, anti-Jewish practice bias that is built in and has been grown upon over these last 1,600 years since the time of Chrysostom. Okay, so a slight mind block there, but yes, since the time of John Chrysostom, for the last actually almost 1,700 years, the prevalent view on this passage is that Paul was teaching against circumcision for all Yeshua believers, including those who are of the Jewish people. And as Messianic believers understand that the circumcision is a continuing responsibility, continuing mark of the covenant for those who believe in the God of Israel, as ones who follow the God of Israel as Jews. For both Jews who believe in Yeshua and those who do not believe in Yeshua, there still is the ongoing requirement to circumcise sons on the 8th day. And Paul does not reject that here, though it is clear he would reject it for Gentiles who were seeking to somehow, like he dealt with in Galatia, who were seeking somehow higher status as Yeshua followers. But we will be okay. And so in this chapter, Paul confronts false teaching from unnamed opponents of the good news of the Messiah, and rebukes the false teaching from either heretical Yeshua followers or one of many pagan opponents in Philippi who could lead the new Philippian believers away from their faith in Messiah Yeshua. Interestingly enough, Paul doesn't actually identify specifically who these false teachers are. He doesn't say, these are, from this group or that group or other. He just used epitaphs referring to them. So that's one of the interesting things in interpreting this passage, that he doesn't actually say, oh, it is this group, it is that is the ones that are the false teachers, but just refers to them by epitaphs that would have been recognizable by the people in Philippi. So we come to actual commentary and looking at the verses here. So we'll be looking at Philippians chapter 3, verses 1 through 2 today. And we begin with verse 1, which was one of the passages that speaks of conclusion, as we talked about. For those who've seen the introduction to the book of Philippians, there are those scholars who believe, because of different breaks in the letter to Philippi, there could be 2, 3, or 4 letters written to the people of Philippi that were edited together into the one book of Philippians, the one letter to Philippi that we have in our Bibles today. And this is one of the passages, one of the verses 3:1, that gives rise to those who believe that there are multiple letters that were actually put together. Though it's clear that people believe that these all of what we have in Philippians was written by Paul. There are those scholars who believe that this was 2, 3, or 4 letters, which were actually combined together as kind of a compilation of Paul's correspondence with the Philippians. And there are those scholars that also believe that this is one letter that was sent to the people of Philippi. But whether one believes this is one complete letter or multiple letters composed to get put together, edited together, all hold to that Paul was the writer of this letter. And that is pretty much unchallenged in the religious and the academic community. This was a letter written by the Apostle Paul. So in verse 1 we read, "In conclusion, my brothers, rejoice in union with the Lord. It is no trouble for me to repeat what I have written to you before, for you it to be a safeguard." This verse in chapter 3 is one of several concluding verses of the letter that have caused much debate, as I said. Some scholars hold that Philippians is an edited collection of 2 or more letters sent by Paul, and the verse in the middle of the letter appears to offer. This verse, I said, offers evidence to those who believe that there are multiple letters edited together. Rather, here than a conclusion to one of multiple letters, Dr. David H. Stern, in the Jewish New Testament commentary, however, suggests that Paul was summarizing a discussion of humility with a warning not to boast. As Yeshua in the Messianic hymn of chapter 3 represented godly humility, the highest example of humility, Yeshua, our righteous Messiah, in his life and death as a slave for us, showed us the highest level of humility. Paul's opponents in chapter 3 represent the opposite of humility, pride. So as we saw in chapter 2, we see in the Messianic hymn, Yeshua, our righteous Messiah, put forward as the highest example of humility. Next, we have later in the chapter the examples of Timothy and Epaphroditus, 2 flesh and blood people that were known to the people in Philippi. And they were set forward as an example to them, continuing the theme of humility, and examples of humility throughout the book. Now here, according to Dr. Stern, is seeing that now Paul is turning to these false teachers, those who are the opposite of being humble, and were demonstrating pride, the opposite of humility. So here we've seen in chapter 2, we see 3 examples: Yeshua, Timothy, and Epaphroditus, 3 examples of humility. Now we'll see an example here in chapter 3 of pride, the opposite of humility. And continuing this theme of humility throughout the book, here now Paul is setting forward a negative example, an example not to follow, an example that represents the opposite of what they are to model in their lives. In commenting on this verse, Craig Keener, a great biblical scholar, interprets the word chaire, commonly translated as in conclusion or finally, as a transition between sections within the letter. So rather than that Keener here, rather than seeing this as multiple letters put together, he sees this use of the word in conclusion, chaire, as a word of transition. Now we're transitioning into another part of the letter. And Jeffrey read another biblical scholar came to the same conclusion that 3:1 is not the ending, but a continuation of the letter. So there are those biblical scholars who see this, though it says in conclusion. So that there are those who believe this was actually the chapter 3:1 was basically the beginning of an ending of one of the multiple letters. They see just the use of the phrase, the Greek phrase in conclusion, to be a transition from the example of humility now to an opposite example, the example of pride. Understood this way, we can see the flow of the letters theme of humility in the example of Yeshua in 2:5 through 11, Timothy in 2:22, Epaphroditus in 2:29, and now in chapter 3, the example of Paul himself. We'll see the example of Paul speaking here. One of the negative example of the false teacher we'll be looking today, and then later in chapter 3, we'll see that Paul is laying for his example of his humility and his willingness to put everything aside for the sake of the Messiah. So we come now to verse 2, where we look at Paul's opponents. Who are these people who are coming into Philippi? Who are these people that Paul is warning about? Who are these people that Paul wants the people of Philippi to be ready for and to reject their false teachings? As I said before, we do not know the identity of the opponents Paul warned about. We just read, as in verse 2, we read, "Beware of the dogs, those evildoers, the mutilated." As I said, we just have epithets here. We don't actually have an actual identification of who these people are, and that's something that causes much speculation on this letter. But most scholars understand the epithets to represent Jewish opponents and false teachers that Paul is warning about. For Paul to call these opponents dogs comes from the notion that it was believed that Jews use this term in referring to Gentiles. This understanding goes way back to early church father John Chrysostom's homilies on Philippians, written in the 4th century. So the majority opinion on who these people are that he calls dogs, evil workers, and mutilated is that they were actually Jewish teachers who were coming to bring a message to the people of Philippi that they were somehow inadequate in their faith, inadequate in their place as one with the people of Israel, because they were not circumcised, they were not converted to Judaism. In essence, these are people teaching against the Jerusalem Council's teaching that Gentiles could and should come to Yeshua faith as Gentiles. So that is the majority opinion that this reference to dogs was Paul actually turning back on these Jewish false teachers. The epithet of dogs that was understood by the early church fathers was commonly how Jews referred to Gentiles. So in essence, we see the church fathers having Paul, himself an observant Jew, calling other Jews, calling fellow Jews dogs. Also we have the reference to the mutilated, the Greek word being katatome, which most commentators see as a derogative reference to Brit Milah, or circumcision in Judaism, which can reinforce the idea that these opponents were Jews that Paul calls mutilators of the flesh. So also this last word, mutilators, is a word that means mutilators of the flesh. That in calling them the mutilators, or using the word katatome in Greek, that there are those who understand this as being a negative reference to circumcision, that rather than being a holy act, that for those who do it for the wrong motives are just mutilating the flesh. They're just They're just, rather than doing the holy act of breaking the law, which is paratome in Greek, they are here misusing it, and therefore causing a mutilation. There are also some scholars that see that the use of katatome as a reference to spiritual mutilation, that Paul here could be speaking about those who, in their false teaching, in what they're doing, more than just physically mutilating themselves, they're actually mutilating their souls by their false teaching, and they're being evil workers, evil teachers. Some scholars also see the word katatome as a reference to spiritual mutilation rather than physical mutilation, speaking about some form of circumcision for Gentiles. And this would point to the false teachers being Gentiles because of this reference to as being a spiritual mutilation, and that these Gentiles are possible recent converts to Judaism who are promoting circumcision of Gentiles. In essence, these false teachers could, another perspective, rather than being Jewish teachers coming to them, that they were actually Gentile converts to Judaism who were basically telling that the Gentile believers in Philippi were inadequate in their faith, inadequate in their connection to the people of Israel because they were not circumcised. That faith alone in Yeshua, which was taught by the disciples, taught by the Jerusalem Council, that they were rejecting this, saying that no, faith alone, coming to Yeshua as Gentiles, was not adequate. Most commentators see this verse and the following verses in chapter 3 as a demonstration of Paul's rejection of Judaism and Jewish practice, which amazingly is totally incompatible with what we have in the biblical record, because we know that even in his last defense of his faith, even that Paul referred to himself as, reference to the Torah, as a Pharisee, that even in his final time before his execution, he understood himself as an observant Jew, as a Pharisee. So it is incongruous to see Paul here teaching against Judaism, against Jewish practice to the people of Philippi here. In refreshing contrast to all that we have set for that pins these false teachers, these dogs, these mutilators as Jews, Dr. Mark Nanos, a Jewish Pauline scholar, is one of the only scholars to question the credibility that Paul, as a Jew, as an observant Jew, would use a derogatory language about Judaism and Torah faithful Jews, whether within or without the Messianic community. There are those like Bachmel, the biblical scholar Bachmel and Boring, who see the opponents of Paul as not actual opponents, with Paul principally warning the Philippians about false teachers that come to Philippi. Back to what we see from Nanos is that Dr. Mark Nanos is one of the only commentators that I've found on the book of Philippians that was willing to question Paul speaking derogatory about fellow Jews, whether Jews who were following Yeshua, who were teaching that Gentiles were not complete in their Yeshua faith, or those from the larger Jewish community, faithful Jews. Paul would call them these things: dogs, evil workers, and mutilated. And it comes about that is almost unquestioned among the commentaries that are available on the letter to Philippi. Among the Christian commentaries, as I said, beginning with Chrysostom to today, there's really no question that Paul is speaking derogatory here of his fellow Jews, even though he would disagree with with their teachings, that is, we get only a questioning that by Jewish scholar Mark Nanos. And I find that refreshing, and I hope to add to that the refreshing perspective that Paul was here speaking against these false teachers, and it's not an attack on Judaism, Jews, or Jewish practice. As I said, there are those like Marcus Bachman who sees that this is a potential threat to the community. As I said, that there are those who believe that there are these actual false teachers were in Philippi at the time, and Paul had heard about it. So then he included that in his letter to warn them to stand against those who are bringing this false teaching, whatever the false teaching that they bring. And there were also those who believed that there was a potential threat, that as Paul has seen false teachers, as I said, as he confronts in the book of Galatians, that had come to disrupt the communities that he had set up, that these were potential threats. So whether a potential threat or a current threat, Paul wants to make clear to the people of Philippi that they needed to reject these false teachings. Whoever these opponents were, they were represented as opposite mindset and lifestyle to that of Yeshua, Paul, Timothy, and Epaphroditus. Biblical scholar Herbert Bateman commented, the depiction of these opponents as self-centered, self-gratifying, and worldly clearly contrasts the self-denying, self-giving, self-sacrificing attitude and life of Yeshua and the lifestyles of Timothy, Epaphroditus, and Paul. So Bateman here is putting forward that as we talk about this here is, and that we saw from Dr. Stern, that in this passage Paul is putting forward a negative example of humility, of their pride, their lack of self-sacrifice, their pride in contrast to the humility of Yeshua, Timothy, Epaphroditus, and as we'll see later in this chapter, of Rav Shaul, the Apostle Paul himself. The proposed identities of Paul's opponents, so as I said, we don't know exactly who these people are, but of the various options, the proposed identities of these opponents include Yeshua following Jews, Messianic Jews, non-Yeshua following Jews, those from the larger Jewish community, newly converted proselytes, and pagan influencers. Let's examine the evidence for these four possible identities. First of all, we'll look at the Yeshua following Jews or Messianic Jews. The first option of these opponents are Messianic Jews who did not accept the ruling of the Jerusalem Council and who were promoting circumcision on Philippian Gentiles that became followers of Yeshua. These opponents could be the same people that Paul spoke against in the letter to Galatia. So first off, we see that these could be Messianic Jews, Yeshua following Jews, who were teaching against the Jerusalem Council, teaching that Gentile followers of Yeshua had to be circumcised and to follow Torah, in essence, to become Jews after becoming Yeshua followers, that they were not fully a part of the people of God and could be more in the people of God by taking on circumcision and therefore taking on a full life as a convert to Judaism. Most Christian scholars understand these opponents as those who are promoting conversion for Gentiles, which would have forced Judaism and Jewish customs on Gentiles for the first time since the birth of the Messianic community. Messianic Jewish scholars and post-supersessionist scholars would see this as a detrimental to the unique place of Jews and Gentiles within the Messianic community, and would certainly counter the Acts 15 Jerusalem Council ruling, which recommended separate ritual responsibilities for Jews and Gentiles. So not only we see a rejection of the Jerusalem Council ruling by these people if they were to be Yeshua following Jews or Messianic Jews who were seeking to compel the Gentile Yeshua believers in Philippi to become Jews also, that they would somehow strengthen their Yeshua faith and strengthen their connection to the Jewish people. We see this is clearly against what was taught in the Jerusalem Council. And as we said, according to those who hold a non-supersessionist Messianic Jewish perspective, in what they were seeking to do would also be detrimental to the distinction in the body of Messiah between Jew and Gentile, and the importance for the Messianic Jewish community and the Christian community to be united as one, though distinct but united, that the full message of the Messiah, the full gospel message, can only be seen in our world as there is a Jewish body of Messiah and a Gentile body Messiah, that in the distinction and in the continuing relevance of the Jewish connection and the Jewish body within the Messianic community, that only in the Messianic Jewish community and the Gentile Christian community can the message of the Messiah be truly presented to our world, is if Yeshua if the Jewish Messiah Yeshua makes Jewish people who come to believe in him non-Jews or Gentiles, then he is not the Jewish Messiah, and that is a rejection of the truth, that only in there being a Jewish people following the Messiah of Israel and Gentile people following the Messiah is there that full representation, that full testimony, as there is both those from Israel and those from the nations who acknowledge the one Messiah of Israel, and both the Jewish world and the Christian world are damaged by there being a separation between these two. So in essence, the understanding of the Jerusalem Council is that the light of the Messiah in the world can only be seen as there being a Jewish testimony to Yeshua and a Gentile testimony to Yeshua. And by these false teachers compelling Gentile Yeshua followers to be circumcised and convert to Judaism, they're in essence nullifying the Gentile testimony to Yeshua by, in essence, nullifying the Gentile witness to Yeshua by Gentiles becoming Jews, in much of the same way as the call within the church for Jewish people who come to know Yeshua, for them to, in essence, to assimilate into the church and, in essence, to become Gentiles and to leave back their connection to and their beingness as Jews. There must be, for Yeshua to truly be the Messiah of Israel, to be truly the one that is to be accepted by all, both Jew and Gentile, there must be a Jewish representation of Yeshua faith and a Gentile representation of Yeshua faith. And this to be an ongoing message to the world, there must be these two witnesses, the Jewish witness and the Gentile witness. These opponents here, if they were to be Yeshua following Jews or Messianic Jews, are classically known as Judaizers, Jewish proponents of Gentile circumcision. These people, as I said, if they were Jewish Messianic Jews who were compelling the Gentiles to become Jews, They're traditionally known as Judaizers. Given that from the time of Abraham, the sign of covenant between the one God of Israel and the Jewish people has been circumcision, these opponents incorrectly champion the circumcision of Gentiles, as we see in Schreiner. And this is writing about those who were Judaizers. And this is from the commentary on the book of Hebrews. Therefore, the Judaizers probably concluded from Genesis 17 that the circumcision was an indispensable sign of the covenant, and thus they taught that unless you were circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. Paula Fredrickson, a Jewish Pauline scholar and one of the great thinkers in the Paul within Judaism movement today, espoused a unique motivation for these, if they were to be Messianic Jews, to promote circumcision of Gentile Yeshua followers. And Fredrickson wrote here, perhaps some of these apostles, in this case the false teachers that coming to Philippi, prioritizing Israel's response to the gospel as a key event leading to the kingdom, sought Israel among the nations quite literally, perhaps in calling for Gentile circumcision as a condition for entering into the ecclesia. These apostles were in their own minds achieving the reconstitution of the plenum of Israel, with all Israel regathered through the message of the Messiah, the kingdom finally come. According to Fredrickson, this was an interesting thing that coming out of her work on Paul. Here she says that these promoters of Gentile circumcision were seeking to make the Messianic community more Jewish by having Gentile male followers be circumcised and all Gentile followers become Jews. So it's interesting is that Fredrickson's perspective on this is that one way of looking at what these people were doing is that as Jews themselves, as Messianic Jews, and understanding the Jewishness of the message of Yeshua, and that it came first to the Jewish people, and the message of Yeshua was necessary to spread throughout all of Israel. And in this, as there were more and more Gentiles that were entering the Messianic Jewish community, that the Jews were becoming a minority within the faith. So Fredrickson puts forward here that one of the motivations of these false teachers could be that they wanted to increase the Jewishness, increase the Jewish populace of the Messianic community by Gentiles converting to Judaism. That if all the Gentile Yeshua followers became Jews, then there would be the solid oneness of Messianic faith being among Jews, and also would be a testimony to them being convicted of that and understanding themselves as a Jewish faith, as the Gentiles who were coming into believing Yeshua would be converting to Judaism. Understood this way, these proponents of circumcision were seeking to reclaim the Jewish nature of Yeshua movement by attempting to make all adherents Jews, by adding new Gentile converts to Judaism, to the born Jews, making the Messianic Jewish community again a Jewish majority. This concern for reaching all Israel, including turning Gentile Yeshua followers into Jews via conversion, would allow the false teachers to seek circumcision of Gentile followers to make the movement more Jewish. So, as I said, we're looking at this way that one of the ways that could be that first thing to put it forward is that these people are wanting to make the now as the message had gone out to the Gentile world, to reclaim the Jewish majority of the Messianic Jewish community, that they wanted to add from those of the nations to being convert to Judaism, to basically make the Messianic Jewish movement, to make the early Yeshua movement more Jewish by the Gentile Yeshua followers becoming Jews, much in the same way as seeking to build up the, there's ongoing concern about building up the Jewishness, the Jewish numbers in our congregations. And here we see these false teachers going against the teaching of the apostles, the teaching of the Jerusalem Council, could be seeking to make there a larger Jewish percentage of the Messianic community by having the Gentiles who came to Yeshua faith come to become Jews, which is a real interesting perspective. That there's always there's just seemingly a negative perspective on what could be done by having the work of those who are promoting Gentile conversion. But here that we see from Frederickson that they could be having a positive motive, though incorrect in practice, to make the Messianic movement more Jewish, returning to the Jewish majority by having all the Gentiles within the movement become Jews. Paul here was not giving a polemic against Judaism or Jewish practice, but was condemning a false teaching that Gentiles need to become Jews to follow Yeshua. Paul rejected those teaching within the Yeshua movement. He rejected this false teaching that Gentiles were not adequate in their faith as Gentiles, that they had to become Jews, be fully part of the Messianic community. Paul rejected this false teaching and not Judaism, especially the circumcision for Jews. Paul himself had circumcised Timothy, the adult Timothy, before their first visit to Philippi. The problem of Gentile circumcision for Paul was his opposition to the false teaching that Yeshua-believing Gentiles must undergo circumcision for full inclusion in the community within the body of Messiah, and that Yeshua faith was not sufficient. For Gentiles, it needed supplementation with circumcision, a false teaching the Jerusalem Council already ruled against in Acts 15. So in rejecting those, as I said, these false teachers that Paul's speaking about were Messianic Jews who were teaching that the Gentiles, Yeshua followers, needed to become Jews to somehow be more part of the community, or, as I said, to build up the Jewishness of the Messianic community by having all the Gentiles become Jews. This was against the teaching of the Jerusalem Council, against what Paul had taught, and that is what Paul is confronting here. He is clear that he's not condemning circumcision for Jews, because as we said, he circumcised Timothy before their ministry, their first time going to Philippi. But Paul here is rejecting a false teaching that Gentiles needed to convert to Judaism to be fully part of the people of God, rather than, as he taught, that Gentiles could and should come to Yeshua faith as Gentiles. Jews would come to Yeshua faith as Jews and would continue to live as Jews. So that will conclude our time today, as we've looked at the first possibility of who these false teachers could be, that being the first group being Messianic Jews or Yeshua following Jews, that could be the ones that Paul was confronting. And we'll be looking at the other four options starting tomorrow. The next time we'll be looking at two groups, both non-Yeshua following Jews and newly converted proselytes. So we will be concluding our time today. Thank you for watching Letter to Philippi Live, and we will be back tomorrow at noon Pacific Time, 3 p.m. Eastern Time, 10 p.m. Jerusalem time, And again, if you want more information on Letter to Philippi, just go to lettertophilippi.org. There you can find recordings of our previous classes. You can leave a prayer request. I want to be praying for you. You can order a copy of my messianic commentary on Philippians in our resource section, which is the basis for our class. You can make a much needed contribution to our work, either a one-time contribution, or even better, if you could make an ongoing monthly or weekly contribution to the work of Letter to Philippi as we continue this work that we began in April of this year. So we're now in the second half of our first year, because we started on April the 12th was when we officially began the organization, and our first teaching began on June 1st with the first time we went through the book of Philippians. So we appreciate you watching. Again, we want to be praying for you. You please leave a prayer request. If you have any questions, you can fill out our contact form on the page, asking a question you have for me. As I said, if you can support our work, we truly appreciate that. And again, we'll see you tomorrow. And we're looking at the other possible opponents, the non-Yeshua following Jews, newly converted proselytes, and the possibility of pagan influencers, which is something that Mark Nanos brought out in his work on Philippians. We'll be looking at those three other options for who these false teachers could be that Paul was warning about in Philippi. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow. Again, this is Sean Inslee from Letter to Philippi and lettertophilippi.org. And thank you for watching, and that will do it for today. Shalom.